Good morning and welcome everyone. I'd like to officially welcome you to the first fall session of the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Centre for Excellence in Indigenous Health. We are very pleased today to welcome Harley Eagle to share his knowledge on cultural safety and the act of addressing systemic racism within systems. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Humathwin people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the Learning Circle. Our circle today is also being co-hosted by the Centre for Learning and Technology, and I would like to take a moment to recognize all of their efforts in ensuring that we can have this session here in the IKB library. So I would also like to remind everyone before we begin that that is participating today, both online and in person, that the topics we cover can often be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure that you're looking after yourself. For today, if you need to talk to a friend or an elder or a counselor during or after the session, please make sure that you do so and seek the help that you need. So I'll introduce our team very quickly, just so we can get straight to the topic today. My name is Cole. I'm from the Chewito First Nation, and I will obviously be facilitating the session today. Behind the camera, you can't quite see us, is Cynthia, our production coordinator. Other members of the team in the room today are Melanie and Leah, and Mike is here today from the center as well. For those of you that are on Zoom, please feel inclined to introduce yourself into the chat box, get to know each other, and get that topic buzzing. So to kick off the circle, I'd like to give a little bit more information about our speaker, Harley Eagle. Harley is Dakota and Ojibwe, and a member of the Whitecap Dakota First Nation. He looks to Indigenous lifeways to guide his work. His experiences include training and consultation in the fields of transforming conflict, anti-racism, dismantling oppression, cultural safety, and trauma healing. He is often invited to speak at conferences both nationally and internationally. Harley holds a Master of Arts in Conflict Analysis and Management and currently resides on Vancouver Island. So with all of that being said, welcome Harley, and I look forward to the knowledge you have to share. And with that, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everybody in the room and also on the webinar, watching from their computers. I also want to add my acknowledgement of the Musqueam territory and peoples. It's wonderful to be in this profound and beautiful land. I also thank you for talking about the nature of this talk. You know, the word racism and systemic racism is a really triggering word. And it means so many things to so many of us, and most of it not good. And so I want to acknowledge that up front and thank you for pointing out to folks that this can be a triggering topic. So I'd ask that you in the room and out there in front of your computers to maybe take a deep breath and know that this is not an easy topic to talk about, and I'll do my best to set a tone that we can engage in such a way that it's helpful and that we can actually hear one another. And I'll talk a little bit more a little later about those kinds of dynamics in talking about systemic racism and how you go about doing this work. I also want to acknowledge the folks here at UBC for inviting me, and thank you also for pointing out FNHA. They're a huge partner of the work that I do with Island Health, and so I want to acknowledge all of their wisdom and experience that they so willingly share with us and journey along in this work. I also want to acknowledge people in this room, as well as people out there who are my colleagues at Island Health or past colleagues with other organizations. I want to acknowledge my partner and my children, because really, you know, this work and the topic and the nature of systemic racism touches every aspect of our lives. And so I can't do this work without working at this at home with my family, as well as other isms too. I want to acknowledge my own sexism. I know that I carry that as a male raised in the society. I shake my head because I think to myself, how could I not be sexist, raised in the society that's surrounded by and sexism is everywhere, just as racism is too. So I want to acknowledge that, and I'm on a journey of trying to undo the patterns that I've been socialized with. And so very much thanking my partner and my colleagues who identify as female, that help to keep me in a certain pattern that's about acknowledging my own stuff and working on my own stuff, and also making mistakes, and thankful that people can point out those mistakes to me and I can try to change. I also want to let folks know that are watching on the webinar that we have a beautiful setup in this room. There's a circle, it's the Learning Circle, so of course there's a circle here, and that feels really comfortable. And so I will do my best to juggle between knowing that there's folks watching on a webinar and also that there's people in this room and that are participating. And thank you for the circle itself. I'll talk a little more about that and how it's been a useful format and forum for engaging in difficult subjects like systemic racism. So I'm going to jump right in and talk about a little bit about myself, so that you know who I am. And one of the reasons why I'm doing this, and one of the reasons why I acknowledged all of those people, it can be summed up in this little story that I was at an event where Richard Wagamese, the author, was presenting, and he was asked a question about a person in the audience who worked with Indigenous young men who were struggling with various life skills and addictions and that kind of thing. And she asked him, what would you do if this room was full of young Indigenous men who are struggling? What advice would you give them? And he said, he thought about it for a moment. He didn't answer right away. And then he said, you don't do it alone. And that's been a powerful story for me to remember, that this work we can't do it alone. I can't be the only knowledge holder or expert in this. It takes all of us learning together and undoing patterns together. And so I'm glad that this room, that you folks are here, and that there's all of these people that journey with me. And so a part of journeying together is building trust with one another. And so that's why I want to share just a little bit about myself, so that you know who I am and why I do this work, and how I came about doing this work. So as was mentioned, I'm Dakota and Ojibwe, originally from Saskatchewan. When I was 15, my family moved to Port Hardy on Vancouver Island, and have lived on and off Vancouver Island for well over 20 years now. I used to tell people that we moved to Vancouver Island because there was a job there for my father. He was a heavy equipment operator all his life. I worked in construction and mining and all that kind of stuff. But really it was because of the fallout of Indian residential school and reserve life and racism and colonization and all of that created dynamics within our extended family where we needed to get away just because of the chaos. And so that's why we moved to Vancouver Island in truth and the reality of it. From there, I met my partner who was working for a social justice organization. And up until then, I knew that there was something called racism because I could feel it. You know, I didn't know the dynamics. I didn't know what the heck was going on, but I knew something was wrong and that I was out of place, that I didn't fit into this world simply because of the color of my skin and being Indigenous. And I heard many stories, and I could share many stories of our interactions as a family and as an individual where it's very evident that I made people uncomfortable or that I didn't fit. And so I began a relationship with my partner, and we ended up working for this social justice organization. We ended up moving to Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and we lived there for 7 years, and our children were born there. We started to do work like addressing ongoing treaty violations, many other kinds of social justice issues that were facing the Oglala Lakota people there on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. And so we got into doing advocacy work and learning about the current realities that face not just the people there, but all Indigenous people certainly in North America and globally, that there's these very similar patterns that are a result of the global colonization experience. From there, we also got involved in doing dismantling racism work. I was invited to become a trainer for an organization. Eventually, I became the director of an anti-racism program in the United States. And it was, it's good to note with that experience that I was invited to be a part of this because there's often, especially in the US, this understanding that racism is a white-black issue. And so the group wanted me to come in because of my Indigenous experience and who I am, to delve into that aspect of how racism impacts Indigenous people. From there, we also talked about the intersections of other oppressions as well within that training framework. And then I also got involved in doing conflict transformation, conflict resolution, mostly using the circle process. And like I say, I'll talk a little more about the circle process in a moment. But it's the way that I prefer to work with folks who are going through conflict, or communities. And it's not that you have to stay in a circle to do the work. It's the values and the principles and the patterns that the circle establishes within us that actually can help us to be different with one another and to be our best with one another, even when we have terrible disagreements and difficult relationships. We can work at it based on what the circle can help us understand and teach us and practice. And then also I started to realize that trauma, intergenerational, developmental, historical trauma, epigenetics, all of those things impact all of us all the time. And so I really needed to understand what is trauma, how do we hold it within our bodies, how is it passed along, how do we build resiliency when we experience trauma, all of those sorts of things. So I got quite involved in understanding trauma, and now I talk a lot about trauma-informed practice. It's one of the grounding principles of the work that we do. And all of those things led me to cultural safety. And I believe all of those things are important to cultural safety: advocacy, understanding trauma, understanding systemic oppression, understanding that we live in a conflict, an intractable conflict situation here in North America, because the relationship with the original people of this land has never, it started in a conflict and it's never been resolved. We still live in that dynamic, but it's become normalized. And so understanding conflict becomes really important in doing this work too, and how we hold conflict, and then how we can move through it. And if that sounds a little bit hopeless, naming that we live in an intractable conflict situation here in Canada, I want to assure you that I believe that if we can apply conflict transformation processes, I believe we can change the dynamics. I really do. And it might take a few generations, but I believe that we can. So I want to start with just some definitions of cultural safety and systemic racism. And I'll start with cultural safety. Cultural safety as a concept came about from the Maori people, the Aotearoa in New Zealand, and primarily nursing students, Maori nursing students, who recognized in a learning environment in Western-styled institutions who they were as Maori women and men wasn't being paid attention to, and they felt unsafe because it wasn't being acknowledged of who they are and what they brought. There was also elements of their experiences of engaging with the health system in New Zealand where it was discriminatory, where it was hurtful. And there's one story of one student talking about her traditional Maori grandparents being treated so disrespectfully in healthcare settings because they still practiced their traditional ways and they followed their traditional ways, and those were looked down upon. And so they wanted to trouble that. Why is there this issue? And so they came up with this concept called cultural safety, trying to create a safe setting for these Maori people to be who they are and who they were, or who they are. And then there was it was further written up, and more research was done, and a wonderful woman by the name of Irahapita Ramsden, a Maori woman, took it even further, and she's kind of recognized as one of the first people to write extensively about cultural safety. And from there, it's grown. Australia has really picked up on it. It hasn't been just the health field. Social work has also picked up on cultural safety, and at various places throughout the world are incorporating cultural safety principles in the way that they do their teaching and educating and do their work. So I'm going to move into now how Island Health. Oh, I should say I work for Island Health. I didn't mention that, on Vancouver Island as a cultural safety facilitator, and it's been 4 years now since I've been doing that work. 2 of us were hired. My colleague Yvette Ringham-Cowan and I were hired 4 years ago now, or even longer. She was hired first, and there was a process of developing this program before they hired us as facilitators. So we've been doing this work for 4 years now. And so I want I think, you know, in talking to you folks today about systemic racism and cultural safety, it's probably easiest for me to talk about it in the midst of story and my experience, so that it's not just academic in the head and theories. It's actual practice of what we're experiencing and learning and doing this work. So cultural safety, you know, if you look at the literature around cultural safety, you'll notice that there isn't one clear definition of what it is. And I believe it's so because every location needs to make it their own. And so, for instance, Island Health, we don't have one clear definition. In fact, when we came on board, we discovered several. And these, what I'm going to share now is 4 or 5 definitions of how cultural safety is looked at in Island Health. But I just want to also say that cultural safety is for everyone. Everyone should be able to experience a culturally safe setting, no matter what your culture is. But we choose to work on it from an Indigenous perspective, from an Aboriginal perspective, because of the history of this land, and because of the original people of this land. And there's tremendous strength in recognizing that, of going back and looking at that whole story, because it's impacted our entire setting here in Canada, that relationship. So it's important to go back to the roots of this work and try to figure out right from the beginning of the coming together of European descent people and the original people of this land, of what went wrong, what were the impacts, what can we do to heal, how can we work together to change the future. So we recognize that there's been this vast history of terrible relationships, genocidal and horrific results and happenings that have been occurring for the last several hundred years here in Canada. And it shows up in the impact on health of Indigenous people. We're always at the bottom end of the list as far as our health realities. And so that's why we work at it. We want to change that dynamic. So the definitions of cultural safety. Oh, just before I do that, I just want to say this. These are some of the foundations of our work that I found when I came into this work, and that have been really important in shaping and given us a really good foundation to do this work on. And that's to recognize that where cultural safety comes from primarily Maori women, and that's really important. Especially for myself as a man, to remember that this came from the wisdom and the experience and how women experience life, and to put something forward as profound as cultural safety. It's really important to acknowledge that it comes from the wisdom and experience of women. And so we try to remember that, and Indigenous women specifically. And then I also want to acknowledge all of the work of the First Nations, Indigenous people here in this part of the world, what is now known as British Columbia. The resiliency and the resistance that the folks here have been a part of for hundreds of years now has resulted in a different setting here in this part of the world. Before I started in this work, I used to hear about cultural safety and the work that's going on in BC, and I was so intrigued and almost jealous because there is this profound work going on here. And I recognize that that comes from the strength of the Indigenous people here who have been resisting and demanding change for decades and hundreds of years. And so that's resulted in all kinds of accords and agreements and statements and commitments, as well as this is also connected to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to action. It's important to recognize that we have those kinds of foundations. Looking to Indigenous community is very important. The work that we do at Island Health was built by the Indigenous communities. We had an Indigenous woman who went around and visited for 2 years with Indigenous communities and came up with how this work should look based on their input, based on her wisdom as well. So it's very much looking to Indigenous community to shape this work, and that's ongoing. And then looking to Indigenous relational practices become really important. And for that, I'll just talk really briefly about the circle. The circle process, many Indigenous people and cultures all over the world use this process. And it's just a really good way of engaging with one another as a group, to talk through things, to be with one another where there isn't just one person telling everybody what to do. We can gather and we can all share our wisdom, share experiences, share whatever it is we need to share so that we can get to a better place. So we look to those Indigenous ways to help guide our work and to make sure that we follow those ways in doing our work, because they're tried and true. They're thousands of years old. They sustained cultures and peoples and societies for thousands of years all over the world. And so it's important to continue to look to them. So to the definitions at Island Health. So we're recognizing that there are differences and respecting those differences, that we're gaining knowledge about self and others to better understand those differences, authentically listening and learning together in ways that maintain the dignity of each individual and builds trust and respect, and authentic collaboration, ensuring improved access to healthcare services, improved health outcomes, and healthier working relationships. So those were 4 that when I came on board, those were here already in our literature around cultural safety. And so those are important. And then, this is my personal favorite. Cultural safety is about feeling respected, feeling understood, honored, cared for. Who you are is important, included in your care and safe to share. And why it's my favorite is that all of those start with feeling. And for those of you that have experienced racism and other kinds of oppression, you might not know what the dynamics are, but you can feel it, right? You feel it. And so cultural safety is about creating places where people feel all of those things. It's also really, really important to me as a male socialized in this society to downplay feelings and to not acknowledge my feelings, and to even not just downplay, but ridicule feeling. That's how I've been socialized as a male. And so this is really important for me in my own healing journey, that it's about feeling. So that's one of my favorite cultural safety definitions. And then further to that, First Nations Health Authority, and again, a big thank you to them and the work that we can do with them and collaborate with them. They have some really good definitions too, and this is how they define cultural safety. And what's important here is the word outcome. So cultural safety is what's hoped for. It's what we aspire to, and it's what that we want to create. It's the outcome based on all of these things, the respectful engagement and all of those things, that result in an environment free of racism and discrimination, where people feel safe when receiving health care. So it's the aspired outcome. We're hoping to get there. And then there's their second definition that's really important for our work is cultural humility. And you're probably seeing now more and more when people talk about cultural safety, they're also including cultural humility. And it's the process. And I dare say it's the starting place for creating culturally safe places. It's about looking at yourself to understand your personal and systemic biases, your behaviors and your attitudes. And that's not easy. That's not easy to go there and look at those things. And so I'll talk a little bit more of how we enter into that difficult work. So what's important in this is to remember that it's about a process. And I just want to say this too, and I'll probably repeat it again, that when we say humility, we're not talking about meekness or shrinking. We're talking about the courage to look inward and to acknowledge what you carry and work on it. And that requires all sorts of strength. So we're talking about something powerful here, humility as a value. And then systemic racism. Now I'm going to work at it, and simply put, it's deeply rooted racism in all levels of society. And the first person to write about this was a fellow by the name of Joe Fagan. And many other people acknowledge or look to his writings over the years to help shape their understanding of what systemic racism is. It's this concept. Well, here, let me show you this. This is a formula that I've worked with for years. It's quite popular. It's used throughout the world in defining racism. So racism is race prejudice plus systemic abuse of power. So that's what, systemic racism strives to look at the power dynamics and the result of when power dynamics are not mutually shared, and they become very hurtful. And that's what racism is. So it's a structure, it's a socialized way of thinking. It's a worldview, if you will. So that's how we define racism. And then I want to also acknowledge the work of Dr. Verna St. Dennis, who she's been doing this work for over 30 years now. She's out of the University of Saskatchewan. And if you get a chance to read her stuff, and she's got some webinars that are really good, and she breaks it down really nicely and powerfully, and it's not easy to look at what she has to share. So I want to acknowledge that again, but it's powerful. And one of the things of why it is that she says in some of her writings that a culturally responsive approach, and so that's talking about looking to Indigenous people and their culture and their teachings to create change, she says, unfortunately, isn't enough. So it's powerful stuff, of course, but it's not enough because there's a piece missing and for me, it's about understanding the systemic nature of how we got to where we are today and why we have these attitudes and behaviors and biases. If you don't understand those dynamics and are working on them within yourself, you won't be able to engage with the powerful and wonderful teachings that come from Indigenous people. So she is saying that the culturally responsive approach isn't enough, and it hasn't had the effect that they were hoping for and have been trying for all these years. And she says that an anti-racism or culturally safe approach is really important because it gets to trouble those structures that have shaped us as individuals. And she also says that it's life-giving. And I've known that for years, and I've said that for years in my own journey of understanding racism, and I often call it working from an analysis. So I've been able to work at racism and systemic racism long enough that I have this kind of understanding of the dynamics of its structure. And I find it I found it so life-giving because it provided, with that feeling of that something is wrong, it provided me an understanding of why. So it gave me insight and understanding of what was going on, and that it wasn't my fault. And it wasn't me that was wrong. It's a system that's been in place for hundreds of years that have created these dynamics. So it's very freeing and life-giving. And Dr. Verna St. Dennis says that, especially for Indigenous people. In our work at Island Health, we also try to work at the issue of whiteness. And so we have colleagues that have engaged, have been on this journey for a while now, of engaging with how they've been racialized as white. And so we've asked them too, is this life-giving for you? And they didn't use the word life-giving, but they talked about the transformation that they've felt and the change in relationships that they've had with their family and their peers who are also racialized white. And so I believe that this approach of addressing systemic racism is life-giving for all, because it provides us with that deep understanding of what we're up against and why things are so chaotic and crazy and hurtful. So how colonization contributes to systemic racism. And I figured the best way that I can describe this to you is to talk about our workshop process within Island Health. Because really, I like the saying that comes from Einstein, who says, we can't, how does he say that now? We can't use the same thinking that got us into the problem to get us out of the problem. So, and I'll talk a little bit later about neuroscience. And so we literally have to change the neural pathways in the way that we think in order to create change. And so, and that's what our process is about. Our job is to train all Island Health staff and volunteers and contractors, all 20,000 staff and 8,000 volunteers and contractors. It's to engage them in this understanding of cultural safety and what that means for them and the change that it requires in them. And so we have a process. And the process basically is we ask people to engage in an online course. And I also want to thank the organization Sanyas for their powerful and profound online course that helps people delve into what cultural safety is and systemic racism. And, you know, we used to hear, and we still do hear a lot that people will say, but it's an online course. And we acknowledge that, yes, it's an online course, but in some ways it's really helpful because people can engage with the material from the safety of their home or from work in front of their own computer. And they can enter into this dialogue, this conversation with facilitators who are, you know, highly trained and very skilled at getting people to go deeper and from the safety of their in front of their own computers. And again, I'll talk about that in a moment, about the neurobiology around that. It's quite powerful, but of course it isn't enough. And a workshop isn't enough. This is something that needs to be ongoing. And again, I'll explain that in a few moments. So I just want to talk about our process to give an example of how we go about what we see as creating change in changing and increasing the cultural safety capability of our organization. So, so it's the online course, then people come to a workshop with us, one-day workshop, and we go over the material. So we look at embracing the past and noticing the impacts and the present-day realities of Canadian colonization on Indigenous people. And that's not easy to do. And what we find is that often creates shame and guilt and outrage and all of those kinds of things that come up for people because people are triggered, right? Or they feel like they're to blame simply because they're racialized as white, perhaps. And so we look to the concept of vulnerability, that it's really important to be vulnerable in this process. And again, that's why the circle is so important. It gives people the opportunity to practice being vulnerable, of sharing very deeply. And we also look to the work of Brené Brown, who talks about vulnerability. And I really like how she says, in talking about shame, she says that shame is held in place by three things: by secrets, by silence, and by judgment. So all of those things, when you're feeling shamed or you're feeling guilty, those things come up, or they're in practice. So we don't talk about the history, or we talk about it in ways that only come from one perspective, and usually an academic white male, from 50 years ago that wrote about something, and we follow that, and it covers up the truth, and we believe that that's the truth. So that's how we keep these secrets. We still encounter people here in Canada that are not aware of the Indian residential school era. We still do, even though there's been all of this work. It's been kept secret, and those secrets keep us from trying to change that dynamic. So secret, silence, and judgment. And she also says that vulnerability is the antidote to shame. It's what can change shame. So by engaging, going deep and looking inside, you can actually start to change those dynamics of shame and guilt by being vulnerable. And then what's really cool, she also says that vulnerability is a gateway to creativity. So if we want to be creative together and we want to work on this together, we have to learn to look inside of ourselves, to be vulnerable, and again, I'm talking about the strength of it, so that we can be strong and resilient together and be creative together in creating change. And so trauma-informed practice, I talked about a moment ago. What I wanted to highlight here, and there's books written on trauma-informed practice, and there's multi-day workshops on how you can engage with trauma-informed practice in your work. But for me, what it renders down to is what I call the motto of trauma-informed practice. And that is, rather than saying that something is wrong with somebody, ask what has happened. So I believe that that's what we have to do to our context here. Rather than saying that something is wrong with each of us, or with white people, or something is wrong with Indigenous people, we have to ask the question, what has happened? And so that's what trauma-informed practice is. It's looking at that history, it's embracing it and engaging with it, as difficult as it is, to understand what has happened and how it's impacted us and how it shows up in our present day realities. We also apply that to the story of colonization here in Canada. So rather than starting the story only 500 years ago, because in my own journey, when I started to uncover the secrets and the silence in the history, and started to learn about these things that have happened to my people, it left me at a really bitter place, because I thought there must have been something wrong with European people to come to these shores in this way. But by applying that trauma-informed practice motto, you ask the question, so what happened to European people to have them come to these shores this way? And for us, we talk about 1,000 years ago, and we look at the history of Europe to recognize that the Indigenous people at that time were being colonized by, and it was the Holy Roman Empire 1,000 years ago. So again, a combination of church and empire, religion and empire, that were doing a very similar thing that's happened here. So, and that's the key to all of this, is to see that it's a cycle. That if trauma goes unresolved, it creates the colonized becomes the colonizer. So we want people to look at that and understand the impact of their ancestors on their life. And I believe that there's a reason why, for many of us, we don't know our history. And those of our ancestors and our relatives who've gone through horrific things don't share those stories with their children. So they pass on the patterns of unresolved trauma without the stories to understand why things are the way they are. And oftentimes those stories are so harmful and so hurtful and terrible. It's, when you're traumatized and it's unresolved and you get triggered, you shut down, you fight, flight, or freeze. And so then we also, so we talk about that, but then we also talk about the present day reality of here in Canada. And we talk about democracy here in Canada. And we ask people the question, what is democracy? And people will share with us, you know, the wonderful principles of what democracy is. And then we'll talk about racism, and we'll ask people to share the words that come to them when we talk about racism. So we end up with two lists. One, you know, this wonderful list of something that we hope and wish our country was about in terms of democracy. And then the other list that's about the difficult and terrible realities of racism. And then we say, so why is it that here in Canada we can have both? Why is it that we still have these terrible things and these policies and patterns that keep Indigenous people where they are, like the Indian Act, and we have the boarding school experience or the residential school experience and all kinds of other things? How can it be here in Canada? So we trouble that, and we start to recognize, and again, I want to thank the work of Sanyas, who talk about it as the narratives, the stories, the socialization that frame our understanding of why things are this way. And we end up blaming people, or we end up not telling the stories, and we judge people and say it's their fault for being the way that they are. All of those things come into play, and so we start to examine those narratives that keep things the same way. And then the hope is to provide counter narratives, and for that we look to the process of cultural humility, that we have to start looking inward at our own stuff, and then the stories that we know, and start to trouble them and change those narratives, and then share those narratives when we hear the old narratives coming up again. Then hopefully we have counter narratives that we can share with others. So I just want to talk really briefly about how systemic racism and other oppressive systemic beliefs contribute to culturally unsafe settings. And I wanted to make sure that I put other oppressive systemic beliefs there, because there's an intersectionality of all of the various oppressive systems that surround us, certainly. And it's not just about, and I don't want to create a hierarchy of you know, that racism is the worst. It's not like that. They all intersect in such a way that create the situations that we find ourselves in and create culturally unsafe settings. You know, there's another kind of motto that goes along with trauma-informed practice. They talk about how that often we do our work in silos, and I'm sure many of you know that and feel that we're not connected in ways that we should be in understanding the dynamics of society. We work in these silos, and rather than building bridges between the silos, trauma-informed practice talks about blurring the lines. And I like that concept of blurring the lines, to recognize that everything is connected. And again, that comes from an Indigenous understanding, but that, you know, something happens over here, it affects something over here. So it's really important to understand how things are connected, including things like systemic racism and other oppressive systems. And very simply, these oppressive systems create the narratives, create the socialization that have us end up stereotyping people, building stigma around certain populations and that kind of thing. And then it keeps a belief system in place that informs us about others and self. It's always, it's seeking to educate us to believe certain things that aren't helpful, and that create fear, and therefore, as well as culturally unsafe settings. And it socializes us to walk as an individual and participate in keeping the system in place without us even noticing it. It's normalized. I spoke about that earlier with the intractable conflict situation that we find, that we live in here in Canada. It's normalized. We don't even notice it anymore. And we're socialized to believe that that's just the way it is. But if we go on this journey of looking inward and uncovering the secrets and breaking the silence, then we notice that there's a different reality and different perspectives out there that we need to pay attention to. So I want to also add a few steps of what we've seen that healthcare providers and educational institutions can take to create and sustain cultural safety. So again, First Nations Health Authority, they use this concept called creating an environment for change. I like how that's worded, because that's what we have to do, is to create an environment where change can actually happen. And I want to talk a few moments now about the neuroscience and neurobiology about this, about how you actually do this. And somebody shared with me an article from the business world, and I found it really powerful and really helpful. And it was talking about the neuroscience that goes along with an organization when change is suggested. So let's say an organization or a company recognizes that it's losing profits and it needs to create some sort of dynamic or big change. And if you're not aware of what's going on for people who are used to doing things a certain way, and you suggest to them that we have to change, something happens in the brain. And so it's really important to understand those dynamics to help create a different kind of dynamic so people aren't triggered. So the first one is that they talk about in this article, and actually the article is called "The Neuroscience of Leadership," and you can find it in the Strategy and Business magazine, and you can Google it and you'll come across it online. But change is pain. So by that they mean that when change is suggested, what happens is it actually stimulates a part of the brain that's right near the fight, flight, or freeze area of the brain. So people are ready to either fight it or to numb themselves out or to just run away from the change if it's suggested. And that behaviorism doesn't work. And by that they mean the carrot and the stick, or the incentive program, or incentive process, or the demand. The order is coming from higher up that we have to do this. It doesn't work, because again it's creating that sense of fear and triggers people into fight, flight, or freeze. And that humanism is overrated. In practice, the conventional empathetic approach of connection and persuasion doesn't sufficiently engage people. So it doesn't sufficiently, but it does get their attention when you treat people differently and you engage with them differently. It gets their attention, but if it's not sustained, if there isn't continued a dialogue on this, then it doesn't keep going. So that's the fourth one, is focus is power. It's really important to keep the dialogue going. And that's what we're finding in our work at Island Health, is that as we talk about cultural safety, we're finding that departments and hospitals and care centers, they're saying, okay, it's great to have the online course, it's great to have the workshop, but how do we keep this dialogue going? How do we talk about this in the break room? How do we talk about this all the time? And so people are recognizing that we have to keep this in front of us in order for change to actually happen. And so one of the concepts that was shared with me from Island Health with some of my colleagues there, they talked about an educational process called 70-20-10. And perhaps you've heard about it. It's been around for a while, and it's talking about percentage and basically saying that 70 or 10% of any new learning should be done formally. So online courses, workshops, anything that takes you out of your regular workflow to learn about something, only 10%. Only 10% of it should be that. 70% should be what can you put around that person in their regular work day, in their regular workflow. And that's where that focus is power is important, is what's around you that reminds you that this is what we're asking for, this is the change that we want, and here's how you do it. And then the 20% is with mentors and leaders, or people that are doing it already, that you can look to say, oh, okay, so that's what I'm supposed to be doing. That's how I should do it. And that mentor or that person can actually provide some assessment of you too. You can ask them, can you watch how I work? Let me know the areas that you think I need to work on. So there's some assessment around that as well. So focus is power. And then expectation shapes reality. People's preconceptions have a significant impact on what they perceive. And so that's where the stereotypes and the narratives come in. That's what we have to change. We have to change those narratives because there's certain expectations that come with the colonial narratives that are out there. So we have to provide counter narratives so that we don't have those kinds of expectations. And then the last one is attention density shapes identity. So again, this goes back to the 70%. This goes back to the sustained dialogue. How do we keep this in front of people? How do we provide spaces where people can actually practice doing this work? And that changes the neural pathways in our head so that we're not using the same thinking that got us into the problem to get us out of the problem. We've changed the neural pathways, so we're thinking differently. And then relational practices. And again, like I talked about the circle process, that helps to change neural pathways by doing something differently, engaging with each other, dialoguing in different ways. That helps to change the neural pathways. We've done some work around community engagement, so meeting with Indigenous communities, and we've done it differently where they direct how we're going to meet. And so we're showing up as Island Health in different ways, and that's helping, and it's based on their understanding of how a meeting should occur. So that's really helpful to change the way that we interact, so relational practices. Value-based, we do a lot of work, kind of pre-work in our circles. We talk about universal values that all of us hope to live by. At least I assume that we all want to live by things like humility and integrity and generosity and respect and courage and compassion and fortitude. You know, we talk about the values, and those serve as the guidelines for our circles. It's values, and those are universal values that we all hope to live by. And the circle provides us a place where we can actually practice putting those into our way of interacting.
Harley, if I could interject for just a moment, we have a question that I think is pretty pertinent for this particular slide. Can you give an example of a counter narrative that you're speaking of? Can you give an example of a counter narrative that you were just speaking to?
Sure. So I often ask this question when we're doing our workshop is has anybody ever engaged with somebody when they've said something that you perceive as racist or discriminatory, and you decide you're going to do something about it, you're going to say something. And then I ask the question, if you've done that, has it gone well? And nobody puts up their hand because it doesn't usually go well. And normally that's because they're triggered because they're saying something, they're based on their understanding of things, and that narrative comes out. And then you counteract it, but from a place where perhaps you don't know a counter narrative yet. And so all you say is, you're terrible, you're nasty, you're racist for saying that. And then pretty soon you're both escalated, and literally you're not hearing each other. Because again, the neurobiology of who we are as human beings, when you're escalated, fight, flight, or freeze, you're not hearing each other, you're not reasoning with one another. So those things don't go well. So a counter narrative would be is when you know, because now you're working on your stuff, you recognize your own biases and your attitudes, and now you've been able to engage with in a different source of knowledge for the history. Or you've listened to Indigenous people tell their story and you've been able to hear it. So now you have a different story in your head. And so then you can provide that counter narrative to somebody. But you do it in a way, and again, if you've been engaging in a relational process, you do it in a relational way. So we often call that process coming alongside. So rather than confronting somebody or running from them or freezing, you come alongside them. And you talk about your own perhaps understandings of your own biases and your attitudes to say, you know, I thought that way a lot myself. And it's one of the reasons why I talk about my own sexism, is because I'm aware of that now, and I have to change that. But it provides a way of me coming alongside people to say, I know where you're coming from. I'm you. I think like you. But here's something else that I'm learning, that I've learned, and it's really powerful. And I didn't know this. And then you share that story with that person, and usually then, because you said you're with them, you're like them, they're not escalated. So then they can hear your counter narrative, and it changes the way that they perceive things, or they want to learn more. They'll say, can you provide me a source that I can learn some more about that? So that's an example of a, so it's not just telling a different story, it's also about a different process, a relational process of engaging in the counter narrative story. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm aware of, I'm just looking at our time here. And then the engaging with trauma-informed practice is really, I think, really important in all of this. I think we all have to understand the impacts of trauma on ourselves as individuals. Let me give an example of how I see that showing up. When we talk about the older story of colonization, and we recognize that there were things going on, 1,000 years ago that created the European nations as we kind of know them this day, like Portugal and Spain and all those places. People start to make connections to that in their own history. And two groups of people that often talk about their connections to their own historical oppression are Irish people and Scottish people. They'll say, yeah, I mean, we lived through a lot as well, and we were colonized as well, but then we came over and did colonizing over here. They start to make that connection back to their own history, and start to recognize that they carry things that need to be worked on. So that's why trauma-informed practice becomes really important. And it also, not only for yourself, but to understand the dynamics, the lay of the land, not just for Indigenous communities, but for our own organizations, for our own departments, for our own hospitals, for our own healthcare settings, for our own workplaces, to recognize the impact of trauma there as well is so important in all of this work. So that's why I put understanding trauma-informed practice becomes really important in all of this. So I'm almost done the slides now. What we are learning and where we are headed at Island Health. Embedding cultural safety and humility throughout Island Health, not just in Aboriginal health, but in all aspects of what we do. That's what I see is going on now in Island's health's life. And I want to say this, it doesn't have to come from myself or our Aboriginal health team or from First Nations communities only. And I'm saying this too because what I'm seeing is when folks who are racialized as white engage with what that means to them, we actually have a facilitated process where folks who are racialized as white can engage in that kind of understanding. They find ways of then stepping up and creating change in their world, or from their perspective, saying things based on who they are as somebody who's racialized as white. So it's not just about Indigenous people saying we need this and we need that. It's about everyone then figuring out their place in this. Now I want to just go back for a minute about why it's important to work from an analysis of racism, systemic racism. If you start from a place that's kind of a balcony view, or I always think about a circle, and I think about the middle of the circle. If you tell the story and if you paint the picture of systemic racism in there, but not centered on you yet, then you can understand the structure of it. And that's where light bulbs start to go off, and you start to think, oh, so that's why it's like that, or that's why this was done, or that's why this is in place. And then you can locate yourself in there. That's kind of the next step, is you begin to locate. So then what does that mean for me? Where am I in this picture? And once you do that, then you start to figure out, okay, so if that's the case, if that's where I'm located in that big scene of of systemic racism, that's my location. Then I'm going to work on my stuff and I'm going to create change from that location. So that's what I mean about folks within Island Health who are doing this deep work with themselves and with each other, are creating change, I think, in really profound ways. And so the embedding of cultural safety and humility throughout Island Health is a shared responsibility. So many people are doing that. I basically said systemic racism address working from an analysis, and that's what I mean. That's what I mean is from an analysis of it, of the bigger structure of it, locating yourself, and figuring out your responsibility from that location. And then I put up two exercises here, the blanket exercise and the village exercise, that have been really helpful for our work. I don't know if anybody's ever experienced the blanket exercise or the village workshop that Kathy Camilleri does, the village workshop or exercise, or the blanket exercise that was started by an organization called Kairos. They're basically experiential exercises. The blanket exercise takes 3 or 4 hours. The village is usually a full day workshop where you get to see the structures of oppression in Canada, present day and the past, which are still in place in a lot of cases and have impacted the situation or the environment to this day. And those are really important because they're a place where people feel, they feel the impact. They're get to experience just a little bit of what that might have felt like and what it feels like for Indigenous people here in this part of the world. So I think that's it for my, so this is a quote that we use in our workshop, and it comes from an Aboriginal activist group in Australia. It's often attributed to a woman by the name of Lila Watson, but she has said it was a group that came up with it. She said it, but the group came up with it, and she likes to make sure that's pointed out, that it was a group, as a cooperative quote. If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. If you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So we're all in this oppressive system together, and we have to figure out our location in it and work at our own healing so that we can work together in different ways. So I think that's all I have. Maybe I'll just leave that slide up.
Wow. So before I do anything else, I'd like to give a round of applause for Harley. That was fantastic. Thank you. Okay. So we will have some questions from the room, but to start off with, we'll just address some of the questions that were through our online service. There's one question that was asked: is there a place that you could recommend where someone could go to learn more about these counter narratives that you're talking about and ways with which you could approach? Is there a resource that you could recommend?
I highly recommend Sanyas. They do some kind of foundational workshops that you can engage with, but then they have secondary ones too, where they're talking about the colonial environment. There's also one, I believe it's called From Bystander to Ally. So that's where you'll start to learn about what's your responsibility and how do you act differently in various situations. So Sanyas is a really good place to start with. There's also some writers that have done some pretty good stuff out there. I'm thinking of, I had her name in my head now, it's just gone. But there's Peggy McIntosh, kind of a prolific writer on racism and whiteness. There's somebody who's, she does work around, what's it called now? Maybe somebody from the audience can help me. It's when it's fragility, white fragility. I don't know if anybody knows the author. Yes. All right, so sorry, her first name is Yes, Robin D'Angelo, and we just heard that she's coming to SFU in, sorry, on November 20th. All right. Yeah, she's a really good writer and kind of frames whiteness in a really good way. And really talks about the fear for white folks going to these places and trying to trouble how the system of racism has racialized folks as white.
Awesome. So we have a comment from Lynn Brooks, just thanking you very much for your perspective that you provided on the issues. Additionally, we have a question about racism in the public school system and what advice you would recommend you give to parents when addressing this issue with their kids, or it's a big one, eh?
Yeah. Well, you know, if you take a systemic look at our world, the education system is just one piece of something that was created out of a worldview that's quite harmful, right? An oppressive worldview. We've been homeschoolers most of our lives, so I speak from a place of recognizing how harmful on our children an educational system can be. I know there's been, you know, changes, leaps and bounds, and educational systems are trying to change that way. But if you paint that picture, that big picture, you'll see that the educational system is just one other piece that's been impacted by systemic racism, right? So my advice to parents is to start looking at their own biases, their own attitudes, and their own behaviors, and start working on their own stuff. I've come to recognize that with my own children, is that the best thing I can do is to work on my own healing, because then I'm thinking differently. I'm not using the same thinking that's been created in me because of these oppressive systems that end up harming my children, because I believe, you know, this society has us believing in a hierarchy, that we're better than our children, and we end up treating children like children long after we should be treating them differently, you know. And again, I'm kind of coming from an Indigenous perspective too, where, like, in my culture, children, they say that, like, in my culture, my Dakota culture, we had a very complex society. You know, and it would take so long to explain how things fit together and why we did things a certain way. But one of my elders, she said, the reason why we did that was to raise beloved children. That was our whole reason for being. And I'm not sure if our present day society has children at the core of why we do things, of making sure that we raise children who are loved and know how to love. So that's why I say we have to work on our own stuff and the impact of racism and other oppressive systems on us, because then we'll think differently and we'll find different ways of engaging with our children and with the school system. You know, trying to figure out what our responsibility is and how we can actually engage differently with the school system to create change there as well. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thank you for that very thoughtful answer. So we just have one more quick question from online, and then we'll open it up to the room. Could you share the name of the village exercise, the person that created that exercise? What that name was again?
Kathy Camilleri is the person who is doing it on Vancouver Island. She travels around to do it as well. Kathy Camilleri.
Great. Thank you. So I'd like to open it up at this time to anybody in the room that might have a question. You just stick your hand up. Just for clarification, for those of you that are watching online, the person that will ask the question in the room, and then I'll repeat the question just so that we're all cognizant of what's being asked. Do we have any questions? I actually have a question to start off with, and it's kind of snowballing on this public school and children and that sort of thing. But I'm hearing a lot through your talk about kind of the need to change the environment with which we operate in. At what age do you think that these types of conversations are appropriate? These types of conversations around cultural safety, do you think it should start when they're very, very young, when they're getting introduced to these public settings like school or like the workplace, or do you think it should wait?
Well, I think that conversations are one thing, our actions are another. And maybe if I say that out loud, maybe I don't think quite that way, but what I mean is, do you remember the slide that said cultural safety is about feeling respected, feeling honored, feeling listened to, feeling that you're able to share? If we can, I think we should be creating those kinds of environments for our children before they enter into the world. Yeah, we have to learn how to create those kinds of settings, so that children feel that they're honored, that they're listened to, that they're respected. But as far as kind of the conversation, especially if you're kind of coming into it and you want to change now, but you've been living your life a certain way up until this point, that's a good question, and I draw on my own experiences. Because my partner and I, she's non-Indigenous, she's white, and so she works on her whiteness, and I work on my maleness, and it's quite we get to practice all the time, and our children were around us ever since they were born. They were around this kind of conversation, and in some ways they know so much because it's natural for them to know these things, because that's what they've been raised with, and not just my partner and I, but our friends and colleagues and all that contribute to their learning. And at the same time, in some ways, it's been hard on them too, because they see it so readily, the patterns of oppression, or the way that somebody will talk to them as an adult to a younger person. They'll feel it right away, and they know what it is, and in some ways it's really it's hurtful, and because they understand what it is, right? I don't know if I'm making myself clear. So I think just as I started with the story of Richard Wagamese saying that we don't do this alone, I think we have to figure out ways of creating a community and groups of people that are doing this work, so that so that our children don't feel isolated in this knowledge and in this different way, that they're with others who are doing this, changing things as well.
Great, thank you. Does anybody? Yeah.
You mentioned this a little, and I wondered if you could see more. I'm curious about, since you worked in the US and in Canada, what you see as differences in the approach to racism and
So to clarify to the online audience, we're just asking a question about the differences between the United States and Canada about approaches towards cultural safety and racism and those types of issues.
When I first started to be a anti-racism trainer, it made sense to people in the US. Even if they didn't want to be a part of the training, they would say, yeah, we have racism here. Of course, we had the civil rights movement, we had slavery. When I would come home to Canada, we would often be met with, well, it's good you're doing that work down there because we don't have racism up here. But that's changing. And that's changed now. I see that Canadians in the Canadian context, people are recognizing that, no, I mean, especially you look at the history of colonization here in Canada, we can't deny that there's racism has occurred and continues to occur. We see it all the time. There's policies and all kinds of things in place. The reserve system, in the U.S., a lot of my Indigenous friends and colleagues would call the reservation system down there prisoner of war camps, right? Because that's what they were. That's what they were originally. They were designed to sequester, to keep Indigenous people in close quarter, guarded with guns. It was a prisoner of war a camp. And that kind of thinking, I think, is still prevalent. That it's, you know, we've kind of romanticized the reserve and the reservation system. We call them communities and that kind of thing, but I mean, we're talking about Indigenous peoples who had control of vast areas of land that are now, you know, have small chunks of places where they can live. And if they do have what they would call traditional territories, it's not nearly the same size. And it's, you know, there's yeah, that system is a big one that we have to figure out. So back to the question about the difference in the United States and Canada. As far as Indigenous people, it's very much the same history. They still have the reservation systems. You still have, the US hasn't really delved into the boarding school. They call them Indian boarding schools down there, but they're starting to now. There's talk of making it a bigger issue, like kind of like they're looking at Canada and saying, we need to do that here because we had the exact same thing here. In fact, they started in the US. There's a conference coming up in a couple of weeks where a colleague of mine will be presenting there to talk about our Canadian experience and how it might be helpful for the US context. The last thing I'll say is, I mentioned it earlier, oftentimes racism in the US is seen as a black-white issue when it's so much more than that. So that's a bit of a problem. So there's different dynamics, but it's still the same kind of oppressive system that's in place, that's based on that same formula. That formula that I shared, you know, people use that all over the world, you know, because there's, and again, if you look at the history of colonization and the spread of those nations, you know, it's no wonder it's all over the world. It's because, you know, that kind of worldview spread all over the world. And there's so much more, you know, one of the things I wanted to say at the beginning too was that I recognize that I have an hour and a bit with you folks, and to talk about all of these things and all of the nuances and all of the profound understandings that we need to have in understanding systemic racism, you can't do justice to in an hour and a little bit. So I'm thinking about something that's called the doctrine of discovery. I don't know if folks have heard of the doctrine of discovery, but it's basically the legal and moral apparatus for colonization that's still in place to this day. You know, court systems still use this concept that European nations have the right to the land based on their interactions from 400 years, more than that, from the 14th century. It's become international law. And that's why, you know, that's what Indigenous nations struggle against and stand up against, to say, no, how dare you say that you have rights to the land based on your interactions as European nations over there, and then you paint the whole land over here to say that you have the right to the land because you made an agreement in Europe. You know, so it's those kinds of things that we're still trying to draw attention to and trouble. Another piece of all of this too is, you know, if you want to look into trying to understand or to recognize that there's global initiatives to try to change these dynamics, like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. You know, that's a declaration that's trying to enshrine and to draw attention to the patterns of colonizations and its effects and what needs to change. It's they call it the form or the format of how nations should be engaging with Indigenous people. And that's something that's, it's actually, it shows up in, as well as the Doctrine of Discovery, in the calls to action, the TRC calls to action. If you read through it, you'll find the Doctrine of Discovery listed there. You'll find the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. You'll find in there saying that folks need to engage in anti-racism training. So yeah, so there's a lot that needs to be done and too much to talk about in this short time.
Okay. Well, with that, I just wanted to conclude by thanking you very much, Harley, for coming and talking with us today, sharing all of this with us. And I also wanted to thank you for the good way with which you approach the work and that you continue to do everything that you do. So thank you very much for that. I want to say a special thank you to our staff and to the CPLT and to the FNHA for making all of this possible. Before I go, quick plug, we have a very packed fall schedule coming up. Over the coming weeks, we're going to host Denise Finley, and she'll share her knowledge on raising resilient children in today's society. The following week, Andrea Medley and Len Pierre will come and chat a little bit about the opioid public health emergency. So those are only a couple of the sessions we have coming up in the fall. We have a huge lineup, and we'd love to see as many of you register online as possible. So you can head over to our website. That's where you'll find the links to register for those sessions. And yeah, so I'd like to conclude with thanking everyone that came in person today. For the live audience, it's been great. And thank everybody that listened in online. Yeah, following along. We'll see you all again very soon. And until then, take care.